We're looking back at this day in local history as part of the Gray Media Initiative, We the People. 41 years ago today, Mississippi's first African-American Supreme Court Justice was sworn into office. Reuben Anderson was nominated by Governor Bill Allain to replace Justice Francis Bowling, who retired. Anderson had been a Hinds County Circuit Court judge for several years before being elevated to the High Court. The Tougaloo College and Ole Miss Law School graduate continued in that role until 1990. Reuben Anderson becomes the first black justice on the Mississippi Supreme Court on January 16, 1985. Your look at this day.